200 Comanche warriors don't just show up at your barn by accident. They come for blood, for justice, or for war. And Jeremiah Stone Calloway was about to find out which one it was. But let's go back to where it all started. 24 hours earlier, the Texas sun was beating down mercilessly on Stone's ranch somewhere between Amarillo and nowhere, when he first spotted the small figure stumbling across his property. At 34, Stone had seen plenty of trouble in his years working cattle. But something about this particular morning felt different, wrong even. He was mending a broken fence post near the creek when movement caught his eye. A child, couldn't be more than 8 or 9, was walking in unsteady zigzags toward his water source. The kid's clothes were torn traditional Native American garments that had seen better days. And even from a distance, Stone could see the way hunger made each step a struggle. Most ranchers in these parts would have reached for their rifle first and asked questions later. The relationship between settlers and the local Comanche tribes had been tense for years, with raids and counter-raids keeping everyone on edge. But Stone had always been different, maybe too different for his own good. He set down his tools and walked slowly toward the child, hands visible and movements deliberate. As he got closer, he could see it was a young girl, her dark eyes too large for her thin face, lips cracked from dehydration. She looked up at him with a mixture of fear and desperation that hit him like a punch to the gut. The girl spoke in rapid Comanche words he couldn't understand, but her meaning was clear enough. She was starving, maybe hadn't eaten in days. Her small hands gestured toward her mouth, then toward the creek, a universal language of need that transcended any cultural barriers. Stone thought about his neighbors, about what they'd say if they saw him helping a Comanche child. He thought about the warnings he'd heard in town about recent tensions with the tribes. He thought about the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. Then he looked into those desperate eyes again and made the decision that would change everything. Without a word, Stone scooped the girl up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing and carried her toward his cabin. She didn't resist, too weak to fight, even if she'd wanted to. As he walked, he could feel her tiny body trembling, whether from fear or hunger or both. He couldn't tell. Inside his modest cabin, Stone set her down gently on his only chair and moved quickly to prepare food. He had some leftover stew from the night before still warm on the stove, and fresh bread he'd baked that morning. The smell of the food seemed to revive the girl slightly. And for the first time, he saw something that might have been hope flicker in her eyes. As he ladled the stew into a bowl, Stone caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Around the girl's neck, partially hidden by her torn clothing, was a distinctive necklace, intricate beadwork and patterns he'd seen before. His neighbor, old Pete Morrison, had described those exact patterns to him just last week. They were the ceremonial beads worn by the family of Chief White Bull, the most powerful Comanche leader in the region. Stone's hand froze halfway to handing her the bowl. If this girl was who he thought she was, he wasn't just helping a hungry child. He was harboring the daughter of the man who could bring 200 warriors down on his head without breaking a sweat. But it was too late to change course now. The girl was already reaching for the food with shaking hands, and Stone couldn't bring himself to turn her away. He handed her the bowl and watched as she ate with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't seen food in days. What Stone didn't know was that 20 miles away, a Comanche search party had just found the girl's trail leading directly to his ranch, and Chief White Bull himself was riding at the head of that party, his face a mask of fury and grief that promised nothing but trouble for whoever had taken his daughter. The girl finished eating and looked up at Stone with something that might have been gratitude. But as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across his property, Stone couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made either the best decision of his life or the last one he'd ever make. The girl fell asleep in Stone's chair within an hour, exhaustion finally overtaking her small body. Stone covered her with his only blanket and tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing. But as evening approached, that conviction started to crumble. The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road made his stomach drop. Stone peered through his window and saw his neighbor Cletus Hartwell riding hard toward his cabin with two other men Stone recognized from town, Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison and the local preacher Reverend Thomas. Stone stepped outside before they could dismount, hoping to keep their voices down and avoid waking the girl. But Cletus was already shouting before his horse came to a full stop. "Stone, you damned fool! What in the hell are you thinking?" Cletus's face was red with anger and something that looked like fear. "Morrison here says he saw smoke signals coming from the hills this afternoon. The Comanche are looking for something or someone." Deputy Morrison nodded grimly. "My father sent word from town. Chief Whitebull's daughter went missing 3 days ago during a hunting party. Word is she wandered off and got lost in a storm." He paused, studying Stone's face carefully. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about a missing Comanche girl, would you?" Stone felt his throat go dry. The smart thing would be to lie to send them away and figure this out on his own. But these men had been his neighbors for years, and despite their flaws, they were here out of genuine concern. "She's inside," Stone said quietly, half-starved and exhausted. "I couldn't just leave her to die." The silence that followed was deafening. Reverend Thomas was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Son, do you have any idea what you've done?" "I helped a hungry child," Stone replied. But even as he said it, he could hear how naive it sounded. Cletus started pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair. "They're gonna think you took her. Hell, they probably already think that. White Bull's been known to wipe out entire settlements for less than this." Deputy Morrison was already backing toward his horse. "I have to report this, Stone. It's my duty, but I'll give you a head start. Get her back to her people before they find you here." "In the dark?" Stone asked. "She can barely walk. And how am I supposed to approach a Comanche camp without getting shot full of arrows?" "That's your problem now," Morrison said, mounting his horse. "I'm riding to town to warn everyone else. If White Bull decides to make an example of you, he might not stop at just your ranch." As the three men rode away, Stone stood alone in the growing darkness, listening to the girl's quiet breathing from inside the cabin. He thought about saddling up and trying to find the Comanche camp, but he knew it was suicide. He thought about loading her into his wagon and trying to reach the nearest town, but that would only make things worse. The truth was, there was no good way out of this. Every option led to the same place, a confrontation with one of the most feared war chiefs in Texas. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new sound drifted across the plains, the distant rhythm of war drums growing closer with each passing minute. Stone's blood turned to ice. They weren't waiting for morning. The Comanche were coming tonight. Stone rushed back into the cabin, his mind racing. The war drums were getting louder, and he could now make out individual beats in the rhythm, slow, methodical, and absolutely terrifying. This wasn't the chaotic noise of a raiding party. This was something far more organized and infinitely more dangerous. The girl stirred in the chair, awakened by the sound of the drums. Her eyes opened wide, and for the first time since he'd found her, Stone saw recognition cross her face. She understood what those drums meant better than he did. She spoke rapidly in Comanche, pointing toward the door and then at herself. Even without understanding the words, Stone could see the panic in her movements. She was trying to tell him something important, but the language barrier made communication impossible. Stone knelt down beside her chair, speaking as calmly as he could manage. "I know you can't understand me, little one, but I'm trying to help you. Those drums, that's your people coming for you, isn't it?" The girl nodded vigorously, then grabbed Stone's shirt and pulled him toward the window. She pointed outside and held up both hands, opening and closing her fingers repeatedly. Stone counted along with her movements. 10, 20, 30. She kept going until she'd counted to what looked like 200. Stone's legs went weak. 200 warriors. He'd been hoping for maybe a dozen angry braves that he could somehow reason with, but 200. That was enough to level every ranch for 50 miles. The drums stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. Stone moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first he saw nothing. Then, like ghosts materializing from the night itself, he began to make out shapes moving across his property. They came in perfect formation. Warriors on horseback spread out in a wide semicircle that was slowly tightening around his cabin. Even in the moonlight, Stone could see the war paint on their faces, the feathers in their hair, the weapons in their hands. These weren't men who had come to negotiate. The girl tugged on Stone's sleeve again this time, gesturing toward herself and then toward the door. She wanted to go to them, but Stone couldn't tell if that would help or make everything worse. What if they thought he'd hurt her? What if they didn't believe she'd come to him willingly? A single voice called out from the darkness, speaking in English with a heavy accent, but perfect clarity. "White man, we know you have taken something that belongs to us. Send out the girl and perhaps you will live to see morning." Stone's mouth went dry. The voice carried absolute authority. This had to be Chief White Bull himself. Stone had heard stories about the man, how he'd united several tribes under his leadership, how he'd never lost a battle against the cavalry. And now Stone was about to face him across the barrel of a conversation that could end with everyone dead. Stone stepped toward the door, but the girl grabbed his arm with surprising strength for someone so small. She shook her head frantically and pointed to herself, then made a gesture across her throat. She was trying to warn him about something. But what? Then it hit him like a lightning bolt. The girl wasn't just the chief's daughter. She was the chief's only daughter. In Comanche culture, that made her invaluable, not just as family, but as the future of the bloodline. If anything had happened to her while in Stone's care, even if it wasn't his fault, White Bull would have no choice but to make an example of him that other settlers would never forget. Stone realized with growing horror that saving the girl's life might have been the easy part. Now he had to prove to 200 armed warriors that he'd saved her, not stolen her. And he had about 30 seconds to figure out how to do that before Chief White Bull lost his patience and turned Stone's ranch into a battlefield. Stone made the hardest decision of his life. He opened the cabin door and stepped outside with his hands raised high, the girl following close behind him. The sight that greeted him was something straight out of his worst nightmares. 200 Comanche warriors sat motionless on their horses, forming a perfect circle around his property. War paint gleamed in the moonlight, and every weapon was pointed directly at him. At the front of the formation sat a man who could only be Chief White Bull, massive, imposing, with silver streaking through his long black hair and eyes that seemed to burn with barely contained fury. The girl ran toward her father, calling out in Comanche. But instead of the joyful reunion Stone expected, White Bull's expression grew even darker. The chief dismounted and knelt beside his daughter, examining her carefully while she spoke rapidly, gesturing back toward Stone in the cabin. Stone couldn't understand the words, but he could read the chief's body language. Every muscle in White Bull's frame was coiled like a spring, ready to explode into violence. Whatever the girl was telling him, it wasn't making things better. Finally, White Bull stood and walked toward Stone with slow, deliberate steps. The other warriors remained mounted, but shifted their weapons, the subtle movement creating a sound like rattlesnakes preparing to strike. "My daughter tells me you fed her," White Bull said, his English precise and cold. "She tells me you gave her shelter." He stopped just outside arm's reach, close enough that Stone could see the intricate scars on the chief's chest marks of countless battles won and enemies defeated. "Yes," Stone replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "She was starving. I couldn't let a child die." White Bull studied him for a long moment. "She also tells me you saw the sacred beads of our family around her neck. You knew who she was, yet you did not immediately return her to us." Stone's heart sank. This was it, the moment everything went wrong. I was going to bring her back in the morning. She was too weak to travel at night. Perhaps, White Bull said, or perhaps you thought to keep her as a prize to trade her back to us for cattle or horses or safe passage through our lands. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Stone could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on him, warriors waiting for their chief's signal to turn this conversation into a massacre. That's not true, Stone said. I never wanted anything from you. I just couldn't watch a child suffer. If you were Stone, what would you do? Throw yourself on the mercy of a war chief who'd never shown mercy to any white man, or stand your ground and defend your actions even if it meant certain death? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Stone decided next would determine whether the sun would rise on peace or on a war that would consume the entire territory. White Bull raised his hand, and every warrior drew back their bowstrings in perfect unison. The sound of 200 arrows being knocked at once was like death itself taking a breath. You will prove your words, the chief said quietly, or you will die where you stand. Stone's mind raced as he stared at 200 arrow points glinting in the moonlight. How do you prove goodness to a man who's seen nothing but evil? From your kind, then inspiration struck like lightning. Your daughter was wearing this when I found her, Stone said slowly, reaching into his pocket. Every warrior tensed, but he pulled out a small piece of torn fabric, part of the girl's original clothing, that had caught on his fence post. I kept it because I thought you might want proof that I didn't harm her. White Bull examined the fabric, recognition flickering in his eyes. It was indeed from his daughter's ceremonial dress, the one she'd been wearing when she disappeared. She came to my water source, Stone continued, his voice growing stronger. I could have driven her away, could have shot her as a trespasser. Instead, I carried her to my home. I gave her my own food, my own blanket. I asked for nothing in return. The girl spoke up suddenly, tugging on her father's arm and pointing back toward the cabin. She ran to the door and beckoned for him to follow, confused but curious. White Bull motioned for Stone to accompany them inside. In the cabin, the girl pointed to the chair where she'd slept, then to the empty bowl where Stone had served her stew. She mimed eating, then sleeping, then pointed to Stone and smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. But White Bull's attention was focused on something else entirely. On the table sat Stone's most prized possession, a small tin-type photograph of his own family. His wife and young son, both killed in a cholera outbreak 3 years ago. The picture was worn from handling, surrounded by dried wildflowers that Stone replaced every week. You have lost children too, White Bull said quietly, and for the first time, his voice held something other than anger. My boy was about her age, Stone replied, his throat tight. Maybe that's why I couldn't turn her away. White Bull picked up the photograph, studying the faces of Stone's lost family. Outside, the warriors maintained their positions, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The girl continued chattering in Comanche, apparently telling her father every detail of how Stone had cared for her. She says you could have taken advantage, White Bull translated, a lone white man with a Comanche child. You could have demanded ransom, could have used her as protection. Instead, you simply fed her and let her rest. Stone nodded. I've got no quarrel with your people, Chief. I just work my land and try to live in peace. White Bull was quiet for a long moment, still holding the photograph. When he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone, including his own daughter. My warriors expected to find a kidnapper tonight. They expected to burn this place to the ground and take your scalp back as proof of our justice. He set the photograph down carefully. Instead, we find a man who showed kindness to a child who could have been his enemy. Stone felt hope flickering in his chest, but he could also hear restless movement outside. 200 warriors had come here for blood, and their chief was talking about kindness. That kind of disappointment could quickly turn into a different kind of violence. But there is still a problem, White Bull continued, and Stone's hope crumbled. My warriors cannot return empty-handed. They cannot tell their wives and children that we rode out to punish a crime and came back with nothing but words. Stone's blood turned cold. What are you saying? I am saying that even though you meant no harm, you have created a situation that demands resolution. My people expected justice tonight, and if they don't get it... White Bull gestured toward the door where the sound of increasingly agitated voices could be heard. Some of my young warriors believe that any white man who touches a Comanche child for any reason must pay the price. They think I am being weak by talking instead of fighting. Outside, someone shouted in Comanche, and the sound was picked up by other voices. Stone couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were calling for blood. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will determine everything. White Bull looked Stone directly in the eyes. There is only one way to satisfy both justice and honor tonight, but it will require something from you that may be harder than dying. Broken Arrow stepped directly into White Bull's path, his scarred face twisted with rage. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, his voice rising with each word, and Stone didn't need a translation to understand the challenge being thrown down. White Bull's response was quiet but firm, and Stone watched as the two men faced off. Chief against warrior authority, against grief, fueled anger. The girl pressed closer to Stone's side, and he could feel her trembling. Other warriors began choosing sides, some moving behind Broken Arrow, others remaining loyal to their chief. The careful discipline that had marked their arrival was starting to fracture, and Stone realized he was witnessing something that could split the tribe apart. Broken Arrow pointed his lance at Stone and shouted something that made several warriors nod in agreement. White Bull's jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of a final warning. But Broken Arrow wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, close enough now that the point of his lance was almost touching White Bull's chest. The challenge was clear. Follow the old ways of blood for blood, or be seen as weak by the younger warriors. That's when the girl did something that no one expected. She stepped between the two men and began speaking in rapid, passionate Comanche. Her young voice cut through the tension like a knife, and Stone watched as Broken Arrow's expression shifted from rage to confusion to something that might have been shame. White Bull translated quietly. She is telling them exactly what happened, how she got lost in the storm, how she wandered for days without food or water, how she expected to die alone on the prairie until you found her. The girl continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. She pointed to Stone, then to herself, then mimed eating and sleeping. She was telling the story of her rescue, and even the warriors who had been supporting Broken Arrow were listening now. She is telling them about your family photograph. White Bull continued. About how she could see the sadness in your eyes when you looked at it. She is saying that you helped her because you understood loss, not because you wanted to hurt our people. Broken Arrow lowered his lance slightly, but his face still showed doubt. He spoke again, this time directly to the girl. And Stone caught one word he recognized, wasichu, the Comanche term for white man, and not a friendly one. The girl's response was immediate and fierce. She stepped closer to Broken Arrow and spoke with such intensity that several warriors actually stepped back. Whatever she was saying, it was having an impact. She is asking him if he has children. White Bull translated surprise, evident in his voice. She is asking him what he would want a stranger to do if his child was dying of hunger in the wilderness. Broken Arrow's lance dropped to his side. The girl wasn't finished. She continued speaking her words, now directed at all the warriors around them. Stone could see the effect rippling through the crowd as hard faces began to soften. She is telling them that judging you for your kindness would make us no better than the soldiers who kill without asking questions first. She is saying that if we punish mercy, we become the monsters that the white man believes us to be. The silence that followed was deafening. 200 warriors sat motionless, processing the words of an 8-year-old girl who had just challenged their deepest beliefs about justice and revenge. Finally, Broken Arrow spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. White Bull's translation came slowly. He says that perhaps the spirit sent his brother a teacher instead of an enemy. He says that maybe wisdom sometimes comes from the smallest voices. Stone felt something shift in the air around them. The tension wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something else, uncertainty perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. White Bull looked at Stone with something that might have been respect. My daughter has just done something remarkable. She has turned a war party into a council meeting. But now comes the hardest part. What's that? Now you must prove to them that her faith in you was justified. Tonight in our village, in front of the elders who have spent their entire lives hating your people. White Bull gestured toward his horse. Are you ready to bet your life on the word of a child? Stone looked down at the girl who was watching him with those same desperate eyes that had started this whole ordeal. But this time he realized she wasn't begging for his help. She was offering hers, and somehow that made all the difference. The ride to the Comanche village took 3 hours through terrain that Stone had never seen before, hidden canyons and secret paths that his people had never discovered. As they approached the camp, Stone could see dozens of fires flickering in the darkness and hear the low murmur of voices as word spread of their arrival. The tribal council convened immediately, despite the late hour. 7 elders sat in a semicircle around a central fire, their weathered faces grave in the dancing shadows. Stone stood in the center, acutely aware that he was probably the first white man to enter this sacred space and live to tell about it. White Bull spoke first, explaining the circumstances of his daughter's rescue. Then came Broken Arrow, who, despite his earlier change of heart, still argued for traditional justice. The debate went back and forth in Comanche for what felt like hours, with Stone understanding nothing except the occasional gesture in his direction. Finally, the girl stepped forward again. This time her voice was calm and measured, but her words carried the weight of absolute conviction. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, never once looking away from the elders' faces. When she finished, the oldest member of the council, an ancient man whose hair was completely white, asked her a single question. Her answer was immediate and unwavering. White Bull turned to Stone. He asked her if she truly believes you would risk your life to save a Comanche child again. Knowing what it might cost you, she said yes without hesitation. The elders conferred among themselves in whispers. Stone's heart pounded as he waited for their decision, knowing that these next few moments would determine whether he lived or died. The white-haired elder stood slowly, his joints creaking with age. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades of wisdom. He says, White Bull translated that the spirits have sent us a test tonight. Not a test of our ability to make war, but our ability to recognize when mercy deserves mercy in return. Stone felt his knees go weak with relief, but the elder wasn't finished. You will be granted safe passage back to your land. But more than that, you will be granted the protection of our tribe. Any Comanche who harms you or your property will answer to this council. Stone could barely speak. I don't know what to say. There is one condition, the elder continued through White Bull's translation. You must promise that if any of our people come to you in need, hungry, wounded, or lost, you will show them the same kindness you showed this child. I promise, Stone said without hesitation. What happened next surprised everyone. The girl ran to Stone and hugged him tightly, speaking in broken English for the first time. Thank you for saving me. Now I save you. As dawn broke over the prairie, Stone rode back to his ranch with an escort of honor instead of a war party. The two cultures that had been on the brink of violence had instead found a bridge in the form of one cowboy's simple act of kindness. Stone's ranch became a neutral ground where Comanche and settlers could meet safely. He never got rich, never became famous, but he lived the rest of his life knowing that sometimes the smallest acts of mercy can prevent the greatest tragedies. And every year, on the anniversary of that night, a young Comanche woman, no longer a starving child, but a respected member of her tribe, would visit Stone's ranch to share a meal and remember the moment when two worlds chose understanding over warfare. The girl who had once begged for food became a translator and peacekeeper between the tribes and settlers. Stone lived to be 73, dying peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by friends from both cultures who had learned that courage isn't always about fighting. Sometimes it's about knowing when to feed a hungry child instead. If you're loving these incredible true stories from the Old West, hit that subscribe button, because we've got so many more tales of courage, conflict, and unexpected heroes waiting for you. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.